Elijah Landon sat in his office, staring at the latest employee reports, frustration tightening his jaw. The coffee chain he had bought 7 years ago had been his pride and joy, growing to 14 locations, but something was off. Complaints had been trickling in, customers unhappy with service, employees quitting unexpectedly, and sales dipping at certain stores. He had relied on his district managers to keep things running smoothly, but now he wasn't so sure. Something was happening at the ground level, and he wasn't going to figure it out by reading reports. Elijah made a decision. He would go undercover. He wasn't just going to walk in and ask questions people cleaned up their act when they knew the boss was watching. Instead, he'd pose as a new trainee and experience the reality firsthand. He picked the busiest location, a downtown coffee shop that had been struggling with high turnover. If something was wrong, he'd find out. A week later, Elijah walked into the cafe under the name Illy. His usual sharp suit was replaced with a simple t-shirt, jeans, and an apron. He wore glasses he didn't need, a scruffy beard he had let grow in, and a slightly different haircut. No one at this particular store had ever met him personally. Most employees only knew the CEO as a name on their paycheck. The manager, a wiry man named Greg, barely looked up from his clipboard when Elijah introduced himself. "New trainee. Great, we're short-staffed." "Don't slow us down," Greg muttered. Elijah nodded, getting to work alongside the other baristas. It didn't take long to see the problem. The team was completely overwhelmed. Orders piled up faster than they could make them. Customers grew impatient. The espresso machine was overdue for maintenance, slowing everything down. And worst of all, Greg was nowhere near the front, leaving the employees to struggle on their own while he lingered in the back. Then there was Tessa Franklin. She was easily the hardest working person behind the counter. She moved like she had been doing this for years, calling out orders, steaming milk, and taking payments all at once. But it was clear she was exhausted. Elijah noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for a cup. "How long have you been on shift?" he asked her during a brief lull. Tessa forced a tired smile. "Since 5 this morning." Elijah glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. "You been able to take a break?" She shook her head. "We're too short-staffed." "Greg says we can't afford to lose anyone for a break when we're this busy." Elijah's jaw tightened. That wasn't just bad management, it was dangerous. A few minutes later, as the rush picked back up, he kept an eye on Tessa. She was moving slower now, blinking hard like she was trying to stay awake. Then, as she reached for a cup, her hands slipped. The cup crashed to the floor, and before Elijah could react, she collapsed. Panic shot through the cafe. Customers gasped. One of the other baristas rushed over, shaking her shoulder. "Tessa!" Elijah didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees beside her, pulse racing. "Hey, Tessa, can you hear me?" Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. Greg finally emerged from the back, frowning. "What the hell is going on?" She fainted. Elijah snapped, his patience gone. "How long has she been working like this?" Greg scoffed. "Probably didn't eat. She'll be fine." Elijah's blood boiled. The man didn't even look concerned. "She needs help," Elijah said, his voice tight with anger. "Call an ambulance." Greg rolled his eyes. "That's a little dramatic." Elijah turned to the other barista. "Call." The barista hesitated, then grabbed her phone. Tessa stirred slightly, blinking up at Elijah. I'm okay," she mumbled. "You're not," he said firmly. "You're exhausted." The ambulance arrived minutes later. As the paramedics checked her over, Elijah stood back, fists clenched. He had seen enough. This wasn't just a bad day, this was a broken system. And Greg was about to get a reality check he'd never forget. Elijah watched as the paramedics helped Tessa onto a stretcher and guided her outside. She looked drained, her hands limp at her sides. The other employees stood frozen, the usual hum of the cafe replaced by uneasy silence. Customers murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads. Greg, however, let out an impatient sigh and glanced at his watch. "We're already behind on orders," he muttered. "Great, just what we needed." Elijah turned to face him, his patience hanging by a thread. She collapsed in the middle of her shift, and that's all you have to say, Greg shrugged. People push themselves too hard. Not my problem if they don't know how to pace themselves. Elijah's hands curled into fists at his sides. He had come here to observe, to understand, but this man's indifference was unbearable. You didn't even ask if she was okay, Elijah said, his voice low with restrained anger. She's not my kid, Greg said. She's an employee. And if she can't handle the job, then maybe she shouldn't be here. Elijah took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay in control. He turned to the remaining baristas. Who's been working over 8 hours today? 2 hands went up hesitantly. And who hasn't taken a break? 3 more hands. Greg rolled his eyes. What's with the interrogation? We have a rush. If you want to work here, focus on the job. Elijah ignored him. He looked at the employees. Clock out, he said. Now. The baristas exchanged uncertain glances. Greg let out a bitter laugh. You don't get to make that call, rookie. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he sent a message. A minute later, the cafe phone rang. One of the employees hesitated, then picked it up. Her eyes widened. She handed it to Greg without a word. Greg frowned and brought the phone to his ear. Yeah. Elijah watched as Greg's posture stiffened. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion, then to barely restrained panic. He mumbled a quick response and hung up. His gaze snapped to Elijah. What the hell is going on? Elijah finally pulled off his glasses, meeting Greg's eyes with cold, steady authority. I own this company, Elijah said, his voice even but sharp. And I just watched one of my employees collapse from overwork while you hid in the back. The cafe fell into dead silence. Greg's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Elijah didn't wait for him to recover. He turned to the remaining staff. Clock out now, he repeated. I'll cover your pay for the rest of the shift. No one here is working a minute longer without a proper break. The employees hesitated, then quickly removed their aprons. Some looked relieved, others still processing what just happened. Greg took a step forward, his voice rising. You can't just shut down the store. I can do whatever it takes to fix this mess, Elijah said. Greg's jaw clenched. Look, I didn't force anyone to work overtime. They stayed because they wanted to. Elijah's expression didn't waver. They stayed because they felt like they didn't have a choice. Greg scoffed. That's not my fault, we're understaffed. What do you expect me to do? Manage, Elijah said. Lead, support your team instead of treating them like disposable machines. Greg crossed his arms. If you think you can run this place so much better, be my guest. Elijah gave him a hard look. You're right, I will. Greg's confidence faltered. Elijah turned to the remaining customers. I apologize for the disruption, he said. We're closing early today to make sure our team is taken care of. Drinks are on the house. Some customers nodded in understanding, others murmured in surprise. Greg looked like he wanted to argue, but Elijah had already made his decision. He turned back to the employees. Go home. Rest. We'll talk tomorrow. The baristas nodded, some offering quiet thanks as they grabbed their things. Greg stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. Elijah met his gaze one final time. You and I are going to have a conversation about your future here, he said. And you're not going to like how it ends. Greg swallowed, his bravado cracking. Elijah took one last glance around the cafe, then walked outside. He had seen enough, and now changes were coming. Elijah arrived at the cafe early the next morning, stepping inside just as the first employees were unlocking the doors. The usual morning rush hadn't started yet, giving him a moment to assess the space in the quiet. The store itself wasn't the problem, the setup was solid, the equipment good enough. The failure had been in leadership, and today, that was going to change. Greg was already there, standing stiffly near the counter, arms crossed. He didn't look pleased, but he clearly knew he was out of options. Across the room, a few baristas gathered near the espresso machine, murmuring among themselves. Their eyes flicked between Elijah and Greg, waiting to see what would happen. Elijah wasted no time. He looked directly at Greg and motioned toward one of the empty tables. Greg hesitated for a fraction of a second before reluctantly following. They sat across from each other, the tension thick in the air. Elijah didn't bother easing into the conversation. What happened yesterday can't ever happen again. Greg exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. I already told you we're short-staffed. What do you expect me to do? Pull extra workers out of thin air? Elijah's stare didn't waver. I expect you to do your job properly. That means ensuring your team gets breaks, recognizing when someone is struggling and stepping in instead of hiding in the back. Greg let out a dry laugh. You think this job is easy? You think I don't have enough on my plate already? I do payroll, scheduling, supply orders, and I have corporate breathing down my neck about numbers. I don't have time to babysit. Elijah's expression remained unreadable, but his patience was wearing thin. Leadership isn't babysitting. It's making sure the people under you are set up to succeed. Right now, you're failing at that. Greg shook his head, frustration flashing across his face. You don't get it. These employees, they don't care. Half of them show up late, the other half quit after a few months, and the ones who stay, they act like they're doing me a favor just by being here. Elijah's jaw tightened. And why do you think that is? Greg scoffed. Because no one wants to work hard anymore. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Or maybe they don't want to work for someone who doesn't respect them. Greg didn't respond right away. His fingers drummed against the table, his irritation evident. Elijah continued, his tone unwavering. You think people quit because they're lazy? They quit because they're burned out. Because they don't feel valued, because when they need help they don't get it. Greg's mouth opened as if to argue, but Elijah wasn't finished. Tessa was one of your best employees, and she ended up in the back of an ambulance because this store runs on exhaustion instead of teamwork. So tell me, what exactly do you think you're managing here? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're just letting things fall apart and blaming everyone else for it. Greg's jaw tensed, but for the first time, he didn't have an immediate comeback. Elijah let a beat of silence settle between them before delivering the final blow. You're done here. Greg's eyes snapped to his, disbelief flashing across his face. You're firing me, Elijah nodded once. Effective immediately. Greg let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. You waltz in here for one day and think you know everything? Elijah's voice remained steady. I know enough, and I know I need someone in this position who actually gives a damn about their team. Greg scoffed, standing abruptly. Fine. Good luck keeping this place running without me. Elijah didn't flinch. I'll manage. Greg grabbed his jacket and stalked toward the exit. A few employees watched quietly as he stormed out, the door swinging shut behind him. Elijah exhaled slowly before turning to the waiting staff. Gather around, he said. The baristas hesitated before moving closer, exchanging uncertain glances. Elijah rested his hands on the table, looking each of them in the eye. I know things have been rough here. That changes now. One of the baristas, a young man with tired eyes, shifted his weight. Does that mean we're getting a new manager? Elijah nodded. Yes, and until we do, I'll be stepping in to make sure this place gets back on track. A few eyebrows lifted in surprise. Another employee, a woman with her hair tied back in a loose bun, crossed her arms. No offense, but most of us have never even seen corporate step foot in here before. How do we know this isn't just a one-time thing? Elijah didn't blame them for their skepticism. You don't, he admitted. But I plan on proving it. A beat of silence passed before the young man from earlier spoke up. What about Tessa? Elijah's expression softened. She's recovering. I'll be reaching out to her personally. The employees exchanged glances again, but this time there was something different in their faces, not just uncertainty, something closer to cautious hope. Elijah straightened. For now, let's focus on making this a place people actually want to work. That means schedules that make sense, breaks that actually happen, and a culture where people support each other instead of just surviving the shift. A few nods followed. Elijah glanced at the time. The first wave of customers would be arriving soon. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." And this time, things would be different. The morning rush hit with full force, but this time, Elijah was right in the thick of it. He pulled espresso shots, steamed milk, and wiped down counters between orders. The employees, initially hesitant about his presence, gradually eased into a rhythm with him working alongside them. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. By mid-morning, things were running smoother than the day before. The tension that had lingered under Greg's management had loosened, replaced by something steadier. Employees weren't just scrambling to keep up, they were moving with purpose. Orders came out quicker, customers looked less impatient, and for the first time in a long time, there was conversation between shifts that wasn't just about stress. Elijah caught sight of the young barista who had spoken up the day before, the one who had been skeptical of corporate involvement. He was wiping down the counter during a lull in orders. Elijah stepped beside him and grabbed a rag. "What's your name?" "Jordan." "You've been here a while." Jordan glanced at him, then nodded. "Almost a year." "That's longer than most." Jordan let out a short breath, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Elijah took the hint. "You thinking about leaving?" For a moment, Jordan didn't answer. Then he shrugged. "I was. But I want to see if anything actually changes first." Elijah respected the honesty. He knew words only went so far. Before he could respond, the door swung open. Tessa stepped inside. She moved carefully, as if still regaining her strength, but she looked better, less pale, more steady. The moment the other employees saw her, a wave of relief passed through the cafe. Jordan set down the rag and walked over to her. Another barista, the one with the loose bun from earlier, joined him. Elijah watched as they asked how she was feeling, the conversations quiet but warm. Tessa smiled faintly, reassuring them she was all right. Then she turned toward Elijah. He met her gaze and motioned toward an empty table by the window. She nodded and followed him over. They sat across from each other. Tessa rested her hands on the table, fingers lightly tapping against the surface. "I should have seen it coming," she said after a moment. "I ignored how exhausted I was because I didn't want to leave my team short-handed." Elijah understood that kind of pressure all too well. "I should have seen it coming too," he admitted. "The way things were running here, it was bound to happen sooner or later." Tessa studied him. "You're really the owner," he nodded. She let out a slow breath, as if still wrapping her head around it. "I guess I never thought someone that high up would actually care about what happens in one store." Elijah leaned forward slightly. "That's the problem, isn't it? If leadership isn't paying attention, people like Greg get away with running things into the ground." Tessa's expression flickered at the mention of Greg. He never listened. Complaints went nowhere. Anytime someone tried to bring up how bad the shifts were getting, he made them feel like they were the problem. Elijah had seen enough of Greg's attitude to believe it. "I fired him." Tessa blinked, then let out a short, surprised laugh. "Seriously? Seriously?" She shook her head, half in disbelief, half in something closer to relief. "I didn't think anyone would ever hold him accountable." Elijah glanced toward the counter, where Jordan and the others were still working. "They deserve better." "And so do you." Tessa hesitated. "So what happens now?" Elijah had already been thinking about that. "I'm bringing in a new manager, someone who actually knows how to lead. Until then, I'll be here making sure things run the way they should." Tessa studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Good." It was a simple word, but it carried weight. Elijah stood. "You're still on paid leave. Take the time you need." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "You're really paying me to sit at home." "You earned it," she exhaled, then gave him a small, genuine smile. "Not gonna argue with that." Elijah watched as she stood and walked toward her coworkers. They welcomed her back with quiet words and relieved expressions. He turned toward the counter, rolling up his sleeves. There was still a lot to fix, but for the first time, he felt like things were actually moving in the right direction. And this time, he was going to make sure they stayed that way. Elijah pulled a worn notebook from his bag and flipped it open. The cafe had quieted slightly as the morning rush gave way to a steady flow of customers, and he finally had a moment to assess what needed immediate fixing. He had already dealt with Greg, but that was just one piece of the problem. Jordan approached with a cautious expression, glancing at the notebook. "You're really taking notes," Elijah nodded. "I need to know exactly what's broken so I can fix it." Jordan hesitated, then leaned against the counter. "Then you should probably know that the supply orders have been a mess for months. Half the time, we're running out of stuff we need, and the other half, we're drowning in things we don't." Elijah tapped his pen against the page. "Who handled ordering?" "Greg, mostly. And when he didn't, it fell on whoever had time, which meant no one really kept track. That explained why the inventory was inconsistent. Elijah made a note to bring in a standardized system, something automated, so it didn't depend on one person's memory." A barista passing by paused near the register, rubbing the back of her neck. "If you're making a list, you should probably add the closing routine. It's a nightmare. Takes way longer than it should." Elijah gestured for her to continue. "The cleaning schedule's a mess. Half the stuff we should be doing daily gets skipped because we're short on time, and then we have to deal with it all at once later. It's why the espresso machine's been acting up. No one had time to deep clean it properly." Jordan folded his arms. "And don't even get me started on training. Most people get thrown in with the basics and have to figure out the rest as they go." Elijah exhaled slowly, absorbing the information. It wasn't just one issue, it was layers of neglect stacked on top of each other. Each problem fed into the next, creating the kind of environment where burnout was inevitable. He glanced toward Tessa, who was sitting by the window, sipping a drink one of the baristas had made for her. She looked slightly more at ease now, talking quietly with a coworker. Elijah turned back to Jordan and the barista. "All right, we're fixing all of it, but I need your help." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "You want us to help run the place?" "Not run it," Elijah clarified. "But you've been dealing with these problems firsthand. You know where the biggest cracks are. If I bring in a new manager, I need to make sure they don't just fall into the same patterns." The barista exchanged a glance with Jordan. "So, what do you need from us?" Elijah set the notebook down. "Honest feedback. What works, what doesn't, and what changes would actually make a difference. No sugarcoating." Jordan tapped his fingers against the counter, considering. "You really plan on sticking around for this?" Elijah met his gaze steadily. "As long as it takes." That seemed to settle something. Jordan nodded and the barista did the same. "All right," Jordan said. "Let's fix this." Elijah turned the page in his notebook. There was a lot to do, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving forward.